afternoon, everybody. I'm Helen Pitcher and I'm your moderator for this event. So delighted that you can all join us. The presentation will be given by two very experienced and eminent people in Byron and Stanislav. And my role will be to keep us to time, to coordinate your questions, to look at the results from the polls, and to make sure that we can answer any questions that you may have going through this. This is a highly topical subject in relation to the effect of corona crisis and whether it's accelerating the end of shareholder primacy. And I'm sure you'll all have some very good questions on that. So at this point, I would like to hand over to Byron.
Very good. Thank you, Helen.
Pleasure.
First, I want to thank Helen and Stanislav and the terrific team at INSEAD. This has been one of the better prepared groups I've ever worked with, so thank you. But to kick things off, we are in an unusual time, and I believe at an inflection point in history. As I'm sure many of you are observing, particularly events in the United States, it's become not just a crisis of COVID, but also a crisis of culture in the United States. And I happen to live in a city where there's a bit of focus, or will be a bit of focus, on the crises due to, I live in Greensboro, North Carolina, and this is where the sit-in movement during the civil rights began. And so it's become frankly, a terrific place to be involved in the things that I do. And generally, I am out in boardrooms. Being in my position at NASDAQ, I am and my team is invited into boardrooms to primarily promote board effectiveness. And we do that through products that we produce. My specialty is board assessment or board evaluation. And we do board and CEO evaluations, for example. And through that, what I'll be reflecting on during this session is my experiences over the last 10 years in boardrooms and where I see trends, and also why I believe that the corona crisis and now the civil rights struggle that I believe is becoming manifest in a significant change in society, and how that will affect the viewpoints of leaders, corporate leaders particularly, and we hope that it will spill over to Wall Street and into the investment community at large. So first, there's this overarching question that's being discussed in many circles and business communities around the world, particularly at the university level, but also it's entered into the boardroom. Technically, the shareholders are going to be the primary owner in our capitalist structure. They're going to be the primary owner of the company, but this notion of stakeholder capitalism is changing the viewpoints of what that ownership means and who is vested in the success of a company. So the important elements is for us to discuss, I believe, today, and to wrestle with this in a healthy way. At what degree does the worker have influence in the boardroom? And that spills over to senior management. It's not because if a board and senior management are divided, then that's going to have an effect both on the tone from the top of the company and the relationship between which group is representing the other key stakeholders. And those stakeholders include not just the workers, the community, the shareholders, but also vendors. And then government has a role to play in this. And I'll introduce the concept of a social contract that is between all of the vested parties that cause a company to grow and succeed. So what has emerged dramatically and differently over the last 10 years The company I founded, it was called the Center for Board Excellence, and it was acquired by NASDAQ a few years ago. I've been CEO of 2 companies, and so I've been an entrepreneur for 25 years, and that's my viewpoint on the world is from that entrepreneurship viewpoint, particularly on business. And so, but I've always thought that there was a specific purpose behind a company, and that purpose was not just profit. It was strange to me. I was a student in the 70s. It was strange to me to see this emergence of shareholder primacy, because I thought, wait, I thought companies are founded to produce a product, and that the purpose of a company is not just to make a profit, but to employ people. It's a wonderful thing to employ people into jobs. It's probably my favorite thing to do in business, and it's interesting. I find that most CEOs love the idea of employment. So there's been something wrong in our viewpoints of capitalism since the 70s. And I think this idea of purpose and what's come out of the Business Roundtable and out of, I'm sure at INSEAD and Oxford and groups around, and particularly academic groups around the world that have emphasized discussions around purpose, that there's the employment element. There's the purpose of creating goods and services that benefit society, and they benefit our respective communities. And this is the social contract that was formed far before the 70s and the emergence of shareholder primacy, largely, I believe, out of the University of Chicago and Milton Friedman's work there at the time. But it emerged to be much more. I think it went to Wall Street, and it became shareholder primacy around the idea of excessive demand on companies to return a profit, and even to return a profit rapidly. And we have to get back to long-term views. And so why would COVID and now the civil rights struggle in America merge together and cause a rapid decline of shareholder primacy? Going to that notion of, are we in this together? Well, COVID is indiscriminate, as we'll discuss more in a minute, but it has significant impact on culture today. And so the whole notion of stakeholder governance and culture are being blended together today in a different fashion than before in the last 50 years. And it's accelerating it's accelerating change, because it's causing us to focus daily on, one, we're seeing death statistics and you can't be human and not be concerned about 100,000 people dying from a disease that's infected the entire world. Last I looked, it was nearly, if not almost every country in the world is infected by COVID. But yet what we're also seeing is rapid emergence of various forms of innovation. And so in these inflection points, we see both the sorrows of crisis, and we see the rapid rise of change and creativity and opportunity. And what we have to wrestle with, and what I hope we can discuss together a little more today, is how do we emerge from this a better society, and one that grows the pie of capitalism for more, and we understand the balance between the various stakeholder groups. One obvious element is that behind a corporate vision, mission, values, and goals, fundamental to that is to employ people to do jobs that grow a company and deliver a quality product that impacts culture and therefore community. And within that, there's a supply chain of vendors that we're also working with that we have this effect on the world, that the business world, in which we're employing more. Because the goal, I believe, of stakeholder capitalism is towards 100% employment at all times. That's the goal. And so what we have to wrestle with now is, how are profits distributed? And what is the distribution method of profits? And so within this notion of redefining corporate purpose, we have to look and say, okay, we have now over 20 million people unemployed in the United States in less than 3 months. And how do we turn that around over the next year as we emerge from COVID? Because it seems apparent that we are going to have a vaccine hopefully within a year. But we're concerned again. We're seeing the statistics rise as we are opening up certain areas of our marketplace. Suddenly, we're seeing spikes in COVID in some of those places, which is a great concern that we would have to close back down if that trend continues. So as we're discussing purpose, we're also looking at a thing like a pandemic like COVID. It's been indiscriminate. It hits, at one point in the United States, one of the wealthiest places in the country had the highest per capita incident rate and was hit hard by COVID. So it is not a disease that preys only on the weak. It seems to prey on a wide group of people, and it's uncertain why some it's asymptomatic and why others it causes death. And this has increasingly brought us together as fear can, as fear is one of those overriding or influential human emotions that bring us together. And so then you couple that with the death of George Floyd and the racism issue that has come into the spotlight, and particularly since there has been a high incidence of death in the African American community, that what we've found and what I've observed over the last several months as we continue doing our board work is that the bias that we have brought into society about shareholder primacy, it has been an antagonist of innovation. And innovation both in the boardroom towards strategic governance, but also innovation towards growing and improving culture as we emerge out of the crisis that we're presently engaged in. So we've had these 3 history-changing events converge at one point, at one time. And as we are beginning to look at the outcome and how we're going to emerge from this, I think it's essential for us to dive into the elements of what we measure as a fundamental aspect of business success. And that historically the measurement was share price in a given listed market. I think we have to look at other measurements which are now being done increasingly. One thing I will highlight is that one of the hottest topics in boardrooms presently today is ESG ratings and ESG statistics. One of the interesting parts of COVID that many of us have recognized is that as we've shut down, we've seen the climate improve. So there's like never before have we had this direct and immediate correlation globally between climate and business, in the sense that as they shut down factories in China, we saw improvement in pollution on a macro scale. So what are we going to measure in the future, and how are we going to broaden the measurements of what return on capital means in particularly important to the board community? So how do we start to measure these? So one of my favorite and a go-to place for me is a group that's emerged based in New York, but they're increasingly a global-looking organization called Just Capital. They're a not-for-profit group that provides insight and information to the public and to companies, and largely to investors. They are an agent of change. They're focused on, as you can see in their metrics. So the first three positions of their metrics are around workers. And without workers, without productivity, a company will never reach and maximize its goals. Rob Kaplan, a former professor at Harvard Business School, and now he's the CEO of the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank. I attended a speech that he gave 2 years ago, and he emphasized something that I think it's very important for all leaders and board members through all of his work. And he was vice chairman at Goldman Sachs. He said, of one of the most important aspects of capitalism that I've seen during my career, Rob said, is that a happy worker is a more productive worker. So worker happiness should be one of the top line goals of a company if we want to have the most productive companies. Then how, as we're measuring those kinds of metrics around worker productivity and worker happiness, they need to go hand in hand, then we need to look at measuring what is the impact of a company on its community? How is it impacting its customers? What is the qualitative output of a company and how their product is being utilized? How is then those products and the production of those products impacting the environment? And then we need to retrain ourselves and investors to look at the long-term view of holding shares. One of the struggles I've always had with, and I hope we can get into this, Stanislav, is that the length of holding. So why should an investor who's held for a month receive similar benefit to an investor who's held for 20 years? So we need a capitalism that emphasizes long-term views on employment, long-term views on the community, on the environment, on vendor relationships, and on shareholder growth. That's where I feel like the debate should focus over the coming months and years around the notion of what is the future of capitalism and why should we view stakeholder interests on a similar or even equal basis. I don't have all the answers to this, but I hope that our next 30 or 40 minutes drives a healthy discussion that helps you all as listeners, because I think that what's coming out of this is fundamental to both the future of leadership, the future of board governance and strategic governance, and capitalism and entrepreneurship for what I believe is essential for a growing and healthy economy that will bring us out of the struggles that we're facing today. So with that, I will enter into our turn it over to Stanislav. I will switch over here. Thank you.
Sorry, actually, Byron, we have some questions for you.
Okay, great. Well, I'm switching the screen and ending my share. I will go ahead, Helen, fire away.
Lovely. Okay, we've had a few really interesting questions. The first one is, the idea of profit is placed with CEOs and shareholders. How can shareholders show up and be seen as purpose-driven in taking up shares?
Well, I think that's a terrific question. One, I would point towards some of the institutional investors that have taken positions on this. I mean, this is one of the major changes that's occurred in my lifetime. BlackRock did not exist when I was in college. And whereas look at all the companies that are 100 years old and large, well-known investment houses, and yet BlackRock influences as much money as anyone today because they're, I'm not sure where they are exactly today, but they're someplace between $6 and $7 trillion. So the shareholder, I would offer to shareholders the long-term view, and I'll shift this. As a shareholder, you are an individual. What does success mean to you? If it merely means profit, I would have to challenge that. If the growth of the worker and those who are producing the products, if their happiness isn't also a form of profit to you, then you have to look at your viewpoint on life. We have to get to the heart of the matter. I mean, this kind of spills over into the racism issue, is what do we really fundamentally care about as values in our society? And one of those values is individual goals. I can't tell people how they should map their goals, but I have seen this, and I've seen this considerably. People sell their company, and they end up taking a lot of Prozac because they're depressed. It's an amazing phenomenon. Not everyone, because a lot of people sell their company and they have a value system that they now go out and do great things. Look at Bill Gates. I mean, the Gates Foundation, I think that brings more joy to the Gates than their Microsoft stock. Yeah. So hopefully that's a helpful direction to the answer. But I'd also, that's a question that I'd also like to hear from Stanislav if you'd like to jump in.
Stanislav there?
I think for the logistics purposes, I'll try to answer this question when I do my piece. I think
okay, great. Good deal.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. That helps. Okay, another question. You've actually started alluding to that in terms of the answer for this next question. And the question is, how tightly is the idea of measurement tied with the bias of shareholder primacy, and leading into it, we can only measure profit? You started to broaden that one out in your last answer, but is there anything else you would like to say?
The only other addition I would have to that is that your horizon makes a big difference. And if your horizon is 1 year, it's different from someone whose horizon is 10 years. And this is a core value that that is a struggle. I do believe that it's one that we should challenge, that was present particularly in the 80s and 90s on Wall Street. And I only use Wall Street as that's the place I knew best because I had lots of friends that were working on Wall Street. I was starting a company at the time. My viewpoint of it was that my goal was to build things that gave people joy. And I wanted to profit enough from that. We have to be, I believe we have to be very careful about the concept of maximization of profit without understanding maximization of society benefit. And that means stakeholder benefit. So each investor has to wrestle with that unto themselves. And that's the challenge I would levy out of a discussion like this, is look at what are your reasons for wanting profit? And what are you going to do with that profit? I can't tell people what to do. They can be as greedy or as benevolent as they want to be. That's, I love capitalism, I love democracy, but I'm going to fight for and the influence of people doing kind of the right thing. And I think people know what that is.
Yeah, okay. And that links into a question in terms of ESG. Has this gone down the priority list as companies are really looking at short-termism and survival because of COVID?
I think it will have a short-term impact on that, in the sense that its emphasis in the boardroom and in reporting, many companies are just trying to get by at the moment. Now, in fairness, a lot of the many large companies are doing okay. Airlines, no. Airlines are definitely in question. Amazon, they're having record, Amazon is setting all kinds of records. For the company that's doing well, we should challenge them to do ESG well. For the company that's struggling, I think we have to continue the fight, understanding that that they have to deal with the limited resources that they're struggling with, according to their COVID. COVID.
And that sort of links to the question of, if there is good and effective stakeholder management, would that actually help to take the shareholders and investment community with the organisation and not leave them prone to worrying about liquidity issues and activism and whether they're going to be taken over?
Well, that's a tough one, because there's a reality in that if a company's in a position of weakness resulting from COVID, it could be due to their strategy set out 5 years ago, or it could be their bad luck. And unfortunately, at present generally in our business world, if a company's in a weak position, they have to shore up their defenses on many fronts, and it makes them very vulnerable to things like takeover. And that's just a tough one.
Yes, it is a tough one. The next question, this is my last question for you, and then we need to move to Stanislav, is a question of, are NASDAQ companies slaves to the quarter end, i.e. non-strategic, and therefore should the stock exchange reform and repurpose itself?
The markets in general are shifting towards and encourage a long-term view. There is a fundamental element of an exchange that it benefits long-term by a viewpoint of sustained and less volatility. So sustained growth and less volatility. So already baked into the markets and should be baked into the markets is a long-term view. Now, having said that, it's being encouraged more and more today, and this has been a learning lesson through COVID. COVID has been like a bright spotlight. It just happened to be at a time in culture where we were already starting to emphasize both diversity and stakeholder capitalism. And all of a sudden, the spotlight came and focused on our world. And so it appears that we are going to emerge to be more ESG sensitive, more long-term focused, and that the markets and the exchanges are going to encourage these things.
Okay.
If I had to bet, I would bet on that one myself.
Okay.
Hopefully I would make a little money if I bet on it.
Great. Okay, well, I think we're now ready for a poll. So thank you very much for your input, and thank you very much for the answers to those questions. I'm sure post the poll, and that's just coming up now. So if we can just give you a little bit of time to answer everybody. So Stanislav, shall we hand over to you now?
I'm ready. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. And Brian, thank you for your passionate presentation. Very good ideas. And I'm sure that they provoked many debates that will take place later on today at the dinner tables of our participants. The COVID-19 clearly made us to reflect on many things, and stakeholders capitalism is one of them. It is a very noble idea, and I have to say I'm very interested in exploring this idea. But COVID-19 also made us to pay a lot of attention to risk management. I think many boards are rethinking their risk management philosophy, from classifying the risks to thinking about companies' ability to adapt and companies' resilience. And that's why I wanted to look at this idea, the idea of stakeholder governance from a risk management point of view. And I would like to offer you some of my thoughts on this one. I will play a little bit the devil's advocate role today, just to make some points bit more clear. So let's start. And I would like to focus not on the whole concept of stakeholder capitalism, but rather what does it mean for a board? What are the implications of the stakeholder governance for the board of directors? Because that's the area of my interest, my academic interest, and it's also the area where I spent a significant part of my time as a chair and as a director. So if we look at the stakeholder governance from the board perspective, it means that when boards make decisions, and that's what the boards do, right? The boards are in the business of making effective decision. They should give equal weight to the well-being of all stakeholders. Sounds good. Sounds very good. The question is how to put it in practice. And here I see a number of challenges that I would like to ask you to think about, because those are real challenges, and I don't think we have all the answers to those challenges. The number one challenge is, who is a stakeholder? If we look in the literature, or if we look into the legal documents, the definition of a stakeholder is an individual affected by corporate decisions. So if we make a list of all individuals affected by corporate decisions, the list risks to be very, very long. If we look in the United States, in the United States, the corporate legislation differs state by state. And if you look at the states that define stakeholders, then you can see the list of stakeholders. I think Brian mentioned almost all of them: employees, customers, suppliers, creditors, local community, society, economy of the state or economy of the nation, and environment. What is interesting, there are some overlaps in all states, but some states would mention suppliers as stakeholders, but other states would not mention suppliers as stakeholders. So the big question for the board, who do we treat as a stakeholder, or whose interest do we take into account when we make those decisions? So far, I'm not aware of any good mechanism for identifying the stakeholders. It's up to the board basically to make a decision. Who do you consider as a stakeholder? The second challenge, probably more profound, how do you identify stakeholders' interests? What are the interests of your employees? What are the interests of your suppliers? What are the interests of your local community? And then the question, of course, is how do you weigh these stakeholders, different stakeholders' interests? One of the approaches has been to try to use financial metrics, money as an equivalent, as a general equivalent, right? How do we measure employees' interest in terms of money? I guess we can work something around wages, and as Byron was suggesting, but how do we measure quality of air in terms of money? How do we measure the quality of, how do we measure safety in the local community in terms of money? This is very challenging. And what is the methodology for making trade-offs? Because boards, as we all know, they always have to make trade-offs. There is no decision that can benefit everybody, right? You can always need to make some sacrifices in order to move forward. So if you need to take into account the interest of all stakeholders, how do you make those trade-offs? What do you try to maximize? As Byron said earlier, you should try to maximize aggregate welfare of everybody. But do you do it at the expense of certain stakeholders, or you do it, or you try to spread this well-being equally? And what is the fair distribution of welfare among all the stakeholders? If you have 10 stakeholders, do you give 10% of the value created to all of them? Or do they make different contribution to your business? Do they have a different weight for the long-term success of your business? So then maybe you need to weight them differently. Those are the questions that need to be addressed. And so far, we don't really have clear answers to that. Another challenge, of course, is how do you align directors and executives' incentives with the interest of all stakeholders? It's a long-lasting debate about how to align interests of executives, directors with the interest of shareholders. We have not really found a good solution yet. But now we're adding complexity to this one by saying, okay, we probably need to add 10, 20, or maybe 100 other stakeholders, depending on the complexity of the business in which the company is in. If we look at today's situation, if we take directors' compensation, especially in the US, the lion's share of this compensation is in long-term stock. The idea is to link the long-term financial interest of shareholders and the long-term financial interest of directors through appreciation of the stock. But if we say, well, this is not adequate, how do we change this? How do we change directors' compensation? What will happen with the labor and control markets? Because they provide very strong incentives to directors. Directors want to be re-elected, right? In the same board, and directors have incentives to join other boards. So they want to be in good terms with shareholders because shareholders vote for them. But if we add stakeholders component to this one, how will the labor market work? How will directors act if they know that now a very significant number of other stakeholders have an impact on their future and on their career? How it will impact the propensity to take risks for the boards of directors. And of course, the same thing is for executive compensation, because that's what boards are doing. One of the major roles of the board is to set up executive compensation. Another challenge, which I think is quite important, is how do we ensure board and management accountability if we move from a shareholder model into the stakeholder model? Will not management and boards use this as an opportunity to insulate them even further from people who own the business and on whose behalf they manage this business? And how will stakeholders influence the board? They have no stock, they cannot vote, they cannot sue the board, or they cannot sue the CEO. What's the mechanism for the shareholders to put pressure on boards and management? Will we not see managerial excuses saying, well, we're not taking risk because we have to protect the workers? We are not investing in China because we need to protect jobs in France. We're not working hard because we actually need to please everybody, and we need to please ourselves because we are very important stakeholders. So 8 hours a day, and I'm done, and I'm not thinking about my business after hours. Of course, I'm exaggerating, but I'm just exaggerating to illustrate my points. There are many open questions. There are some answers, and Byron shared with us some of the approaches. But I think they need to be thought through further. And at the same time, I think maybe there is an easy way to go about this. Rather than complicate things, look for the answer which is already already there. And I would like to offer you this answer, and I would like to ask you to think about this as a potential alternative to stakeholder governance. So what's the answer? Let me start with the dialogue, which I was a witness of. This dialogue took place just at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis. Two people acting here, the chair and the founder of a large multinational company, and the professional CEO. And the chair asked the question, I cannot understand this new BRT statement and all the fuss around this. What do they want? And the CEO, who of course knows the statement and understand what it is, basically says, they say we should work for all stakeholders, not only the shareholders. And I think the answer, the chair gives a very good answer. What's the point? We always do. We help develop the town and where we have our major production facility. We build technical university. We work with the government to improve schools. We collaborate on COVID-19. We share it with vendors, our production system. When we buy a new plant, before doing anything, we go meet with local governments, sit down with the unions, and then we develop a program. If we don't do it, we cannot build a sustainable company, which will outlast me and even you. So I think that's the answer. And the answer is in the codes. If you look in the governance codes of almost all European countries, you will find the answer there. The answer is that the board should work for the long-term sustainable development of the company. The board does not work for stakeholders. The board works for the institution. But the only way you can have a sustainable institution is by understanding and taking into account the interest of all your stakeholders, starting with the shareholders. So that's where I think I would like to stop. Thank you for listening. I'll be happy to take your questions.
Okay, Stanislav, thank you for that. That was really helpful. There are a couple of questions here. One is, are some stakeholders more important than others? So that's the first part of it. And the second part is around large family firms taking a much longer term view. Is there something that other firms can learn from this?
Both great and difficult questions. And I don't have a straightforward answer. I think sort of my philosophical answer is that all stakeholders are important for the business. From that perspective, they are all equal, but the impact on the long-term sustainability of different stakeholders at different periods of time may differ. And we as a board, we need to recognize it and we need to deal with them with this understanding. So that's my answer to the first question. And the second question about large family businesses, could you put it up?
It's basically large family businesses tend to take a longer term generational view rather than a short-term view that's driven by organizations that have other shareholders.
I would add to this. I think some family businesses where family members are trained in taking long-term view are taking longer-term view than other businesses. And there are some family businesses where, unfortunately, boards are not taking a long-term view. And that's why so many family businesses do not survive into the second or third generation. Most of the businesses that manage to pass this third generation, they usually know how to train family members in taking this long-term view. And this is a skill. This is a skill that needs to be developed and that could be developed. And this family are very good at doing this, but others are not. And this is one of the reasons why they fail.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And then another question is, does Byrons' analysis resonate with Russian companies?
It does. I think the list of stakeholders may be different. In Russian companies, you will have government at different levels, very high in the list of stakeholders. But overall, it does resonate with Russian companies. I would say in Russian companies, the shareholder primacy or financial investor primacy is not as pronounced as it is pronounced in the United States, for example, because the stock market in Russia is not so much developed.
No.
Russia is still private, mostly dominated by private owners, and it's still a first generation of business.
Okay, all right. Another question is very much around remuneration and the way remuneration strategies are formed at the moment. Does this not bias the executives in those organizations towards maximizing short and medium term profit at the expense of other stakeholders?
Theoretically, it should be biased toward maximizing long-term profits for the shareholders, but does it always work this way? No, and that's why we have so much attention to executive compensation from shareholders, and not only shareholders and other stakeholders. And I think the boards still have a long way to go in mastering executive compensation. The question is, what is your compensation philosophy? And so far, the compensation philosophy of 90% of boards was that we need to align long-term shareholder interest with long-term interest of executives. And that was enough. Is it enough these days? I don't think it is enough. I think the board should elaborate a different compensation philosophy. And again, my take on this would be, you need to create long-term financial interest of executives with sustainable development of the company. Mm-hmm. That's what you link it to. And I think it's a little bit easier to measure than to measure directly to measure interest of all stakeholders. I think it's a Herculean task to measure interest of all stakeholders and to have metrics in executive compensation which will reflect. I just simply don't see how that could be done. But long-term development of the institution, it is possible, and we have examples of companies that do it.
Yeah. Okay.
And Helen, if I can jump in there real quickly.
Byron, excuse me, let me just finish, because there was one question that
go ahead.
I promised to answer, right, about shareholder and long-term investing and the purpose of the company. We used to hear about value investing. Now we start hearing about values-based investing, and that's, I think, what it comes down. If the company has a strong purpose and the purpose resonates with me, I think I am ready to take some discount in terms of my expectations of return on investment, because I will feel good by giving my money to the company whose purpose I support. And company can use it as the way to attract investors. They need to be more vocal about their purposes. They need to communicate with investors about their purposes. A lot of the CEOs are shy doing this. They have the purpose for the employees. They believe in purpose for themselves, but they say, well, if we talk about investors, they say, well, this is a bullshit. Give us money. But this is no longer the case. Sorry.
Sorry, Byron, you wanted to make a comment?
Well, and emphasizing there's a key stakeholder here being the investor and the investor's horizon. I reemphasize that investors play an extremely important role in this. They have to decide, those who have the capital to invest have to decide what kind of neighbors do they want. And what I mean by that, what kind of community does one want? And if I would hope that the thing I like about Just Capital and the work they're doing is that they're making it competitive, or even cool, if you will, to be just, to do good things, and to be that's part of the social reward of being a good investor. Focusing on being a good investor is to be somebody who has helped their community or the workers within a company, and therefore executive pay and worker pay need to be similarly aligned. Can't have executives looking short term and then tell the workers, oh, we want you to think in terms of the long term.
Yeah.
Because that confusion is it undermines the fundamentals of a company.
Okay. Stanislav, one final question for you, and then we'll move to your poll, if that's okay.
Please.
Yeah. Lovely. So do you think non-executive directors are being pushed to act more like executives due to COVID and governance requirements and also shareholder expectations?
Not at all, and I'm very happy about that. We're running a survey, and I think we got about 300 answers so far, asking chairs, board members, and CEOs about what's changed in how boards operate. And one of the findings is that most of the boards kept the line. They became more engaged, they spent more time with the companies, but they did not cross the line. They did not become executives. They changed the frame for executive action, but they did not become executives themselves. And I think that's a sign of maturity of corporate governance in Europe. We have responses from 19 countries, 19 European countries, and pretty much everywhere. We probably have about 10% of boards where it actually happened. But in 90% of the cases, the board managed to stay where they have to stay. So I'm very pleased with this.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. Would you like to run your poll now?
Well, we would like to offer you another poll, which might look similar, but we will very much appreciate if you answer the questions. For MBA classes, we use it as a attendance check, the polls. How many
We're here, Stanislav.
dead souls are there, but probably not for this group of people. Okay, so we got 75% of people who voted. I think probably we can stop it here, and I'll share the results. So I have to thank people who supported my pitch about the company. I think we got 31% of the vote, followed by key stakeholders and then by all stakeholders. So stakeholders combined still winning, but the company has improved.
Okay, good. Excellent. Thank you for that. Are there any other points that either you or Byron would like to make in our last 6 minutes?
I would like to thank the organizers for bringing up this important theme. And I've been thinking about this, but you inspired more thinking about this. And Byron's presentation and the conversation that we had with him was very useful. So I want to thank everybody. This was very educational for myself.
Yeah. Byron?
There was a question about, and it relates to, do stock exchanges need to be reorganized? And for those of you interested in this topic in general and that specific question, there was yesterday, there was a webinar, or it was really an interview on CNBC, but it's on YouTube. And it's Adina Friedman, our CEO at NASDAQ, and Paul Tudor, who is the chairman of Just Capital, and one of the interviewers from CNBC here in New York. And I would encourage you to watch that. It's one of the more interesting interviews I've seen in the last few months, and it talks specifically to these subjects. So if you go and type in Dina Friedman and Paul Tudor, you'll be able to watch that interview. It's very good, and it speaks directly to this. But my answer to that question is I don't think the stock exchanges need to be reorganized. I think our thinking about the role of non-executive directors and stakeholders is what we need to reorganize.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you both very much for a very stimulating and informative discussion. And thank you to all of our participants who sent in some good questions. We couldn't answer all of them because we've ended up with, just looking at my question count, 43 questions. Some of them were very similar, but a lot were really quite different and some country specific, but some very good questions in there. And certainly food for thought going forward. But I agree that, this is a very important inflection point for us in society, globally in terms of COVID, in terms of racism, in terms of broader ESG challenges, and it behoves the board to pay attention to not only the short term, but more importantly, once those that have cash problems are out the other side of that, post-COVID, to really focus on the long-term sustainability. And my personal view is that the S in ESG will become bigger and even more important. And my hope is that we will come out of this a kinder society. So thank you both for that. Can I just remind everybody going forward that there's a couple of things to be aware of. We do now have an aspiring directors program, as well as the IDP, which is the International Directors Program, which basically helps people prepare themselves for boards, and for those who are on the IDP to be on the board. So just to be aware of those. And also there will be a continuing number of webinars going forward that you will have the opportunity to sign up for, which we would encourage you to do. And as both Stanislav and Byron have said, a lot of thought went into the organisation of this, both from the two of them, but also from the INSEAD team. So if you could share your feedback with us, we would be very, very grateful indeed, because we want to constantly be working on our content and the way we interact with you all in order to, as we say, certainly in ICGC, to make sure we are a force for good in governance. And that does mean aligning stakeholders' interests. It does mean looking at long-term sustainability. And that is a balancing act that we as board directors, be it executive or non-executive, all need to be cognizant of going forward. So thank you everybody for your time and participation. Any final words, Byron, from yourself or Stanislav?
I appreciate all the I appreciate all the questions, and would be happy to receive more in the future from anybody interested in these excellent questions I'm seeing on the board.
Excellent. Stanislav?
Thank you, everybody. I'll study questions. I don't have answers to all of them, but they're very thought-provoking.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. On that note, I think we will close this, and we've got about 30 seconds left to go on the time. So we've managed to pull it in on time. Sorry we couldn't answer all your questions, but we're all prepared to do so going forward if you would like us to. So thank you very much, and have a good day, everybody.